Okay, so I think we'll get started. People are starting to join now. So hello and welcome. My name is Jeanette Whitaker. I'm from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'm the project lead for Biomass Connect, and today I'm going to be facilitating this fascinating and informative webinar, which is our last one of 2024. Now, I don't know about you, but this year has just shot past at the speed of light. I can't believe that it's nearly Christmas. A few weeks ago, I thought Christmas was sorted, but I've just been presented with a new present list from my brother. I found out my husband's working on Christmas Day, and my student-aged son wants to bring 2 Italian friends home for Christmas week. Now, I'm sure everyone has got this kind of version of this going on at home, and so hopefully it'll be relief that for the next hour you can put all of that to one side and learn something new from our wonderful Biomass Connect experts. So, on to today's subject. So, biomass crops, like short rotation coppice willow and Miscanthus, are often wrongly considered to be different from other crops. People think that you can plant them and then leave them to it. They are low input crops, but they do still need a sharp eye to make sure they produce the yield outputs that you're hoping for. And so, in today's webinar, we're aiming to help you understand the nuances of growing these crops. It doesn't take much to impact on the performance of a crop. If you make an error at the start, that can dictate what happens next. And there are, of course, environmental factors, the Great British weather, which is out of your control and can be hard to predict. So, just like my perfect Christmas, you might have a plan A, but it's worth having a plan B just in case things change. Now, anyone who's attended a Biomass Connect webinar before will know the drill. So first of all, I'm going to do a big plug for the Biomass Connect website. I'll do a little bit of an introduction from me before I hand over to our 2 illustrious speakers. After the speeches, there'll be a Q&A, and then I'll wrap up with a few more bits of information for you. So first of all, let's talk about the Biomass Connect website. So the website is really growing into the single largest web portal for information on biomass crops anywhere on the web. It has all of the latest news, an extensive events calendar, lots of in-depth technical articles, fact sheets and case studies covering all of the different biomass crops, and loads of information on our demonstration sites. So please look us up at biomassconnect.org after the webinar, and you can get even more information on biomass crops from there. Now, 2 final things before we get started. First, a caveat. So the speakers today are not BASIS registered, and so technically cannot make recommendations on pesticide use. They will be talking about pesticide use in biomass crops and their experiences of it and potential uses, but just to emphasise that if you are thinking about using pesticides on these crops, advice from a BASIS registered agronomist should be sought. That anyone using a professional pesticide must have a recognised specified certificate, and that applications should be made strictly in conjunction with the product label. These are legal requirements, and it's really important that these are taken into account. The second thing to tell you is that if you've got questions and queries for our speakers, please ask using the chat function. It's a webinar, and so you're not able to ask questions in person. So if you put them into the chat, I'll moderate the questions when we have the Q&A session at the end of each presentation. Today, we are talking about Plan Bs and how to turn it around when something goes wrong with willow and Miscanthus crops. We've got a really great couple of speakers who have faced many of the challenges, and they'll be passing on their wisdom and combined 36 years, really, of combined experience, so that you don't have to learn the hard way. In the second half of the webinar, Chris Ashman from Aberystwyth University will be focusing on Miscanthus, but we're going to kick off with Will Macalpine from Rothamsted Research. Will Macalpine is a willow breeder, but over his 21 years in the job, he's established over 100 biomass crop trials and has also led the gargantuan task of getting all 8 of our Biomass Connect demonstration sites planted across the 4 nations of the UK, which has been an absolutely huge task, which he's delivered just admirably. So, Will, over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction, and hello to everyone, and thanks for joining today. So I'm going to start by just introducing short rotation coppice willow as a crop before we talk about some of the pitfalls and things to avoid. It's a relatively new crop, so that's why perhaps maybe some of you won't know that much about it. It's only been a subject of research since the 1970s and in domestication for biomass crops since then. So it's relatively new compared to lots of crops that farmers will be used to. It's planted with woody cuttings, which is quite different. So this is a 20 centimetre dormant woody cutting. We plant at a rate of around 16,000 cuttings per hectare. The crop is perennial, and that makes it very different from crops that a lot of growers are used to. So once it's in the ground, it stays there for a long period, over 20 years, and it's harvested on roughly a 3-year interval, but it grows back all by itself from that coppice, that harvest event. Average yields are around 10 to 12 undried tons per hectare per year. That's assuming you get things right, with a scope for a little bit more in certain circumstances. And why are we interested in the crops? So willows can deliver security of fuel supply. They offer greenhouse gas emission savings when used as a fuel, especially compared with fossil fuels. They can be grown profitably on low input, on less productive land with low inputs, making it a great option for some growers. They can provide brilliant biodiversity benefits, so habitats for birds, pollinators, and small mammals, and so on. They also can provide water quality benefits and perhaps a natural flood management solution and reduce nutrient runoffs in certain circumstances. So all round, there's lots of potential from this crop. And this is the typical 3-year coppice cycle. So planting on the left and then your normal 3-year cycle between harvest. So this is what harvest intervals look like over a 23-year period, which may go on for longer. Now, these crops, as Jeanette said, have got a reputation of kind of looking after themselves. And if you get things right at the beginning, in some ways they really do. But this area that I've highlighted in the time before planting and the months following planting are just the most critical time. So if you use time to look after this crop and prepare for this crop, this is the kind of make or break time, and this is the area that I'm really going to be focusing on today. And if you get this right, it can all go really well. But if you get it wrong, it can be a terrible mistake, and it can be an expensive mistake which you may regret. So get it right, and then the reputation of having an armchair crop that looks after itself can work out. Okay, so let's talk about the kind of preparing, and before you even think about ordering material, these are some of the steps you should go through. And I'm really not wanting to be reactive to mistakes. I'm really proposing that you don't make the mistakes in the first place, and really plan and look for knowledge and incorporate in your plans. And that classic saying, failing to plan is planning to fail, all the 4 Ps or whatever, but it's really, really important. So some people might not know the need for an environmental impact assessment. This can take time to get and is a really important step. So if you're starting to think about it, think about what classification of land you've got and reach out to your Forestry Commission official and ask the questions about having an environmental impact assessment. It may be needed or it may not, but this can take some time, so do this first. Then kind of do a grazing risk assessment. So think about, do you need to fence it? Do you need to invest in that kind of protection? It can be as simple as going, you know what, there's a field of sheep or a field of cattle next door that are grazed and it's not very stock safe, so I need to patch that up. Or it could be that there's a whole lot of rabbits or deer or hares nearby, and you need to think about how to protect the crop from that. And again, it's really vulnerable in the establishment phase, can tolerate some grazing from game later on when it's established, but those young succulent shoots are really important. So think about protecting it from vertebrate grazers. And it's an excellent time to think about the nutrients at the site, think about pH, P and K, and then plan in any corrections for these early on. You can do this when you're planting, but later on it might be more difficult. So do some soil sampling and look at that. And then most important thing is look at the potential weed competition. So this can be, depending on your setting, if you're in an arable setting, it might not be so bad. If you're in a grassland setting, it's maybe a bit more to think about. And if you've got a land area that's been out of management, really have a look to see if you've got some stubborn perennial weeds. And if this is the case, you might need to take a year out of production before you plant to kind of prepare the site. So assess the weed competition. So this weed competition is a really serious issue. There's been papers that have looked at it, and we've seen repeatedly that you get between a 50 and 97% yield reduction if you get weed competition wrong. Thankfully, this isn't a site that I manage, but this is a willow crop that was planted this year, and you can see it's suffering from some terrible weed competition, and it's very difficult to spot a willow in there. Now, thinking about the biology of these crops, they're actually a pioneer species. So their only real mechanism for competing against weeds is having canopy closure. So getting up there, having a leaf area that shades out weeds. And until they get that, they're vulnerable to weed competition. So this is why it's so important. And I think sometimes people think, oh, it's a woody species. It's a bit like establishing forestry where you can get away with a little bit of competition, perhaps. But it's not the case in willow, especially when you're planting with 20-centimetre cuttings. So really think about weed competition. So once you've done that piece, you need to think about what willow varieties that you're going to plant. And the recommendation is to plant a 6-way mixture. But it's important to make sure that you've got a diverse 6-way mixture. It's quite easy to select 6 willows that might be siblings or mother and daughter or highly related, but it's important for lots of other factors like pest control and all sorts of factors to get a diverse 6-way mix. And so there's some great resources to think about this. So don't kind of make the mistakes. Look at the resources that are out there. The EnviroCrops website is excellent and has got a brilliant best practice guidance. So have a look at that. Accelerating Willow Breeding and Deployment has got a grower's guide to willow varieties, and this talks you through the diversity and also proposes some yields, so you can make selections there. And then when you have your discussions with your contractor, who you might be getting the planting material from, you've got some experience and can have some knowledge about the willow varieties that they might be able to get for you. When picking a contractor, I think it's good to define some measures of success and also define roles and responsibilities. So it could be that you do the land preparation and then put on pre-emergent sprays, for example, but just have the conversation to decide who's doing what so you can plan for it, and it's not a surprise, say after planting, that you've got to very quickly get some pre-emergent sprays on. And also with regards to establishment rates, think about the what a success is, and decide who's responsible for that. Think about your field and which direction you're going to plant the double rows. Typically, these crops are planted in a twin row design, and you've got a container, whether it's a trailer or a bunker, that collects the wood chip when you harvest. And you want to think about the capacity of that. So if your row is too long, you might not be able to collect the wood chip from the first pass. That will lead to spillage and potentially yield loss. So think about those practicalities and talk to experts about that. And then all of the weed competition, talk to your agronomist about a plan to control weeds, and they'll be able to give you advice on the specific weed flora that you've got where you are. and come up with a plan. And like Jeanette said, we're not able to give advice, so you need to get it from qualified people. And then order any of the plant protection products that you come up with a plan. And then think about planting time. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just a highlight of some of the resources. Webinar 1 in this series was actually talking about planting and growing these crops. So there's some really great advice from Mike Cooper and David Watson of ECC. Again, Willow and Miscanthus experts. So this hopefully will sit really nicely with this webinar. There's the EnviroCrops best practice guidelines, and again, the AWBD varietal guide. So check them out. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're on to planting. So you've prepared the site, you've cultivated it, you've got a good seed bed, and you've chosen your varieties, and the contractors come and planted. You've got a window immediately to decide if you gap up then. You probably need to plan that to make sure that you've got some spare cuttings around, but you can walk the rows and identify that you've got gaps that day. You need to kind of make sure you've got staff for that and people that are ready, but it can be good just to gap up any small gaps then. And also it can be quite transparent what's done there. The other option is to leave that till the end of the establishment year to do that. And I'm saying to do that immediately because the next task is rolling the site so you can get good contact with pre-emergent sprays. Now, the current 2 pre-emergent sprays that go well with Willow are Flexidor and Stomp Aqua. They're the kind of commercial product names, and they do a really good job at protecting the crop for the first kind of 6 weeks or so and give quite good together a broad spectrum of control. They need to go on between planting and before the cuttings buds burst. So you've got quite a quick time, and this can be really quite quick, like a matter of 2 or 3 days if you're planting in May when the soil's warm. So having this in stock and being prepared for it is really important. Then once that's gone on, it's about monitoring. Like I said earlier, in year 10, if you've got a successful crop, you don't need to check it that often, but really walking a kind of weekly frequency after planting can really pay dividends. So things to look out for are weeds emerging, and also potentially vertebrate grazers. So seeing if you've got a problem and trying to deal with them before you've got it in. And weeds that could come up, you could just have a small patch, which you could do a spot treating with a knapsack and just deal with that. Or if you've got a grass problem, you can consider an overspray of a graminicide. Again, talk to your basis qualified agronomist about this. And if you've got a thistle problem, you can, again, overspray with a split application. So that's 2 applications of a product called Dow Shield. You need to be very careful to avoid application on a very hot day. If it's above about 25 degrees, you can get some scorch, but this can deal with some thistle issues if you have them. And then if the weed conditions are bad, it could be that you use an inter-row sprayer like pictured to carefully apply glyphosate. This is designed, obviously glyphosate will kill the willows, but the shrouded nature of the inter-row sprayer will mean that the willows aren't affected. So this can be done, but it always needs quite quick decisions to deal with issues before competition actually happens. So monitor early on and make decisions. So this is a field that was established. This is a few weeks old, and you can see it looks pretty good and looks pretty clean. There's maybe a few bits of gapping up that are needed, but generally that looks like a really good site. So like I said, you can gap up instantly after planting, or you leave it till the end of the first year. So this time of year in kind of December, January, February, when the material's dormant, and gap up with 60-centimetre rods. You've also got a management decision whether to do first year cutback or not. So the first year material tends to be quite single stemmed. You might get 1 or 2 stems per plant. We're seeing that commercially, people don't tend to do first year cutback, and you just leave it for 3 years, take your first year harvest. Take your harvest after 3 years. That harvest will be slightly lower than normal because you've just got 1 or 2 stems. Then you get to your coppice form, but you can do a coppice of 1-year-old material in the winter following planting. And this can be really useful if you've got some weed issues that kind of have bubbled up and you haven't got on top of them, because it allows you access, again, to do the spraying that I mentioned before, whether that's inter-row or whether that's overspraying with Dow Shield or things like that for thistles. So you have got that option if things have gone wrong to do first year cutback and get in. And this has got the benefit that you do actually coppice the plant. So each stem will have multi stems. So when your next harvest, you will get a higher yield. So that's a good option to think about. Another thing to look out when the crop's established is willow beetles. Now, this isn't something that happens every year. It can be a sort of 1 in 8 year or 1 in 10 year thing, but when it comes, it can be quite bad. And something that you can plan to mitigate the risk of this is having a diverse mixture. So this means that you will have less vulnerability to a beetle attack. So that's something that's baked in early on, but if you don't do that early on, it can come back and bite you. Willow beetles can be a problem, and this is the picture of some larvae that are doing damage, but adult beetles can do some damage as well. You can manage the site by the beetles kind of overwinter in dead wood, so removing fallen trees from nearby can help mitigate this. And there are some insecticides that can be used, but these get good insects as well, so the decision needs to be really informed on this, and you need to talk to your agronomist, but there are options if this comes up. The final bit of advice is if inundation comes, if you've got flooding event, if you know that your site is vulnerable to flooding, maybe think about doing a 2-year harvest, and then if things go wrong in the 2 years, you can harvest the following year. The great thing about willow is that you don't actually really use yield. Like an arable crop, if you have a flood event, it could be disastrous, but the biomass will still be there. It's just you can't harvest it at that time. So you'll know your site, you'll hopefully know if you're vulnerable to flooding, and then consider a kind of more frequent harvest frequency as a hedge. You can also think about harvesting in the autumn or the spring, so slightly out of season, to do it before the flood comes. But if all's not lost, just delay it till the next year. The danger is if you delay it too much and you've got really high diameter 4 or 5 year material, that might be too difficult to harvest for conventional machinery. So you get into difficulties then. Okay, I think that's me.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Will. Yeah, really useful insights there. We'll just field a couple of quick questions before we move on to our next speaker, if that's okay, Will. And so please, if you've got questions, bob them into the chat and I'll ask them as we go. But just to kick us off, I've got one. Are there any ways to minimise the sprays? So you talked about use of glyphosate and other herbicides. Are there ways to minimise that through management practices?
Yeah, and of course, if people are farming in organic systems, these recommendations aren't very helpful because they're not going to be allowed to use them. I think if you are kind of reducing sprays, you need to use more cultural things. So mowing, inter-row mowing, inter-row strimming, and maybe even inter-row cultivation. So rotivating in the inter-row space can all be other tactics to control weeds. And I think if you are using reduced or less herbicides, I think you need to just be even more vigilant because weed competition can spiral out of control. On a smaller scale, some growers have used mulches and things like that. This is an option, but I think you need to think about cost. For small scale growers, we see some different varieties of willows are grown for basket willows, and they quite often use a Mypex sheet. They can be great if you're just planting a very small area, but you need to watch out that the matting doesn't kind of bite into the expanding stool. You can get damage as the stool kind of expands and the sheeting cutting into that. So there are different options out there, and I guess I was talking more about normal conventional agricultural scale.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Will. And just one more from me. What are the key mistakes to avoid? And maybe just specifically, what would your recommendations be in choosing the best mixture? You know, where you mentioned the variety guide, but where do people start when thinking about mixtures?
Yeah, so I think there's two things to get: yield and also diversity. Diversity is really important because you've got different sources of resistance, things like rust. It can confuse different palatability levels for beetles and vertebrate grazers. So having that as intimate mixture as possible is really good. And it's almost like your insurance policy when you plant. Monoculture just isn't really needed for this crop, and it's risky, and it can put pressure on resistant sources in the crop. So one thing we don't really see in commercial plantations is rust, because breeders carefully breed in rust resistance, but we really don't want that breaking down. So the mixture is a key thing in kind of stewarding that. And then of course yield. So making sure that you've got diversity is just really important, and then look for data on yield so you're getting the highest yield possible.
Great, thanks very much, Will. I think we'll move on now, but I'll be bringing Will back in later on after Chris has spoken, and there's more opportunity for questions, so please keep them coming. Now, earlier I mentioned the amazing Biomass Connect website. Excuse me. Now, I just wanted to draw your attention to some really important resources that you'll find there. So first of all, just to mention that Will talked about environmental impact regulations, and we did actually have a webinar on that. I can't remember if it's earlier in the year, but it's certainly on the website. So if you are interested in that particular issue, please look up that webinar. But also more generally, if you want to find out more about Willow and Miscanthus, then the website has everything that you possibly could need. So if you like lots of reading material, then take a look at our information resources drop-down menu, where you'll find technical articles and case studies. And if you prefer watching or listening, then take a look at the new media drop-down, where there's lots of videos and audio clips, if that's how you prefer to digest your information. So these are just some of the resources that you can find at biomassconnect.org. Now, moving on, our second speaker is Dr. Chris Ashman from Aberystwyth University. Now, Chris joined the Miscanthus breeding project at Aberystwyth as a glasshouse technician back in 2009. However, soon after joining the team, he moved to researching the establishment and agronomy of Miscanthus. So he has 15 years of experience, and during that time, he's established field trials across the UK and Europe, and currently leads the biomass crop field team at IBERS, who manage over 60 acres of trials at IBERS and at sites across the UK. So lots and lots of experience, real lived experience of growing and harvesting Miscanthus. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Jeanette. And afternoon, everyone. So I think I'm probably going to start this presentation with echoing actually quite a lot of the things that Will said. So whilst we're sort of talking about Plan Bs, and we'll talk about some of the remedial action that we can take, really it's just as important with the Miscanthus that we get everything right at the start. And what we can do to get things right at the start and avoid any issues will really make our lives a lot easier to start with. But as a sort of a quick introduction to what Miscanthus is. So Miscanthus is a perennial grass from Asia. It's established from rhizomes, and there's two varieties that are sort of commercially available within the UK. Both of these are sterile, hence why we sort of need to go for the clonal production and the rhizome planting. So if we think about the growing season of a Miscanthus plant, we'll start to see it it will start emerging sort of mid to late April. And then we'll go into real rapid growth throughout summer and autumn. And so we can, beginning of the spring, we'll start with absolutely no plants at all. And then by the end of the autumn, we're looking at sort of up to 3 meters of plants. And throughout the summer and autumn, the plant is also then moving sort of nutrients back down into the rhizome and storing that up for the winter and spring. And then as we move into winter, we will start to see the crop senesce and go into its dormant phase, and we'll see a lot of leaf drop as well. And this is then going to sort of relocate minerals back into the soil and also help us with a bit of mulch to help manage those weeds. Going on later into the season, into late winter, we start our harvest. So sort of February, March time, we'll be looking at harvest. And then once we've removed all of that material, we've got a little bit of an opportunity to sort of manage a few weeds and things like that. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. With the fact that Miscanthus is being really very efficient at managing its nutrients, you shouldn't ever need to apply any fertilizers. But there's kind of one caveat to that, and that's when we're establishing the crop, it's important that we have a soil pH of 5.8, and then we're looking at phosphate and potash soil indices of 1 to 1.5. And if we don't have that, then we need to manage that prior to planting. Okay, so what do we have to do to get Miscanthus in the ground and get it growing? Well, there's a couple of different processes that we'll need to use, and really that's dependent on whether we're going sort of post-arable or post-grassland. Generally, our life is a bit easier if we're following an arable crop compared to a grassland, and there's a little bit less for us to do. But it's still really important that we aim to get everything right from the start. So what we'd be looking to do is, once the crop's been removed, we'd plough the land in the autumn. And if you know that your organic matter is quite low, then this is a good opportunity to maybe put some manure on prior to planting to up your soil organic matter. Come the spring, then we're going to need to ensure that the seed bed's weed free, and then we can cultivate the land. Now we're looking to cultivate down to about 6 inches or 150 mil, and ideally we'll do this as close to planting as possible. And best case scenario, we've got the power harrow a couple of passes in front of the planter, and the planter just follows the harrow. Whilst we're planting, we're going to be planting the rhizome using a semi-automated planter, which we'll have a bit of a look at in a sec. And after planting, the land needs to be rolled just like the willow, so that we get the good soil contact with the rhizome. And obviously going on from then, we then need to really manage our weeds and pests to allow that first establishment year to go as well as possible. So as I say, going into grassland is a little bit trickier. There's a little bit more for us to do. And a few more things that we need to think about. Obviously, first off, we're going to have to remove the grass. So this is generally with something like a glyphosate spray. And then we'll plough. And ideally, then we're going to stick in something like a mustard cover crop and keep that growing over the winter. Obviously, then that needs to be incorporated over the just before planting. And then we'll cultivate the land just as we did sort of in the previous slide. If we're going into a really long-term grassland, where there's certainly a risk of a big weed burden, but also the possibility of things like wireworm, then we might want to think about sticking in a break crop. And obviously this holds you back from establishing your Miscanthus for a year, but it can really aid with getting everything right to start with, and then make your life a lot easier going forward. Okay, so when it comes to planting the rhizome, as I said, we generally use a semi-automatic planter. So there's a few different planters available or sort of out there, but they all work in the same manner. There's a hopper that's filled with rhizome, and then people on the back of your planter will be filling a carousel, which will then drop the rhizome at the appropriate spacing. And I'm sure we all know tractor drivers that think that every job has to be done as fast as possible, and the only way to do a job is at sort of flat out speeds. But this really isn't the case for Miscanthus planting. We're far better off slowing it down and getting everything right to start with. And the forward speed of your tractor should be matched to the slowest person on the planter. Each time you get a miss in that carousel, that's a gap in your crop, and there's no way the Miscanthus will spread into those gaps. So then we've got to go in and fix that at a later date. So as Will said, the weed management is essential, especially in the first year. Now, we're quite lucky that if we're trying to manage broadleaf weeds, we've got a few herbicides that we can apply that make our life pretty easy. So we can look at sort of an MCPA based herbicide, something like Agritox, or then other chemicals such as Chimera MX or Harmony MSX. And all of these chemicals applied at the right time can be really effective on broadleaf weeds. However, grass weeds are significantly trickier for us to manage. Any herbicides that are active on the grasses, they're also going to be active on the Miscanthus, and so we'd risk killing our crop. Luckily, because the crop goes dormant in the winter, we've got an opportunity to get in and apply a sort of a glyphosate-based herbicide late winter whilst the crop's dormant, and whilst we'll hit the grasses, we'll not cause any damage to our Miscanthus. It is essential with this application, though, that you time it right. If you get it too late and your crop's already emerged, then you're just going to kill your crop. But we all know that winters are getting wetter. We know that they're getting more unpredictable. So there may be a chance that you can't get your sprayer onto the land. And this is exactly the situation that we see in this right-hand image. So this was a crop that was planted a couple of years ago, and it didn't get its first year glyphosate spray. And you can see here what we've got is a fantastic crop of Yorkshire fog and some Miscanthus pushing through. In these situations, obviously any spray we put on the grass is going to kill the Miscanthus. So an alternative to that would be to mow everything off, remove that material, and then apply a little bit of manure. We'll stick on the manure to counteract the nutrients we've taken off from the green cut, but it also provides a little bit of a mulch to manage that grass. So then looking at the pests and diseases that can affect Miscanthus, we're actually pretty lucky. There's not many things that like to eat Miscanthus. It's not very tasty, but there's a couple of things that we need to look out for. At establishment, we need to be thinking about the impact of wireworm or leather jacket larvae. And this is really why we're thinking about putting those cover crops or break crops into prior to planting after grassland. Once we've planted the Miscanthus, there's not a lot we can do about it. So it's really important that we get that management sorted first. Once the crop's established, neither the wireworm or leather jacket will cause much damage, but in that establishment phase, it can really limit your yield. But much more common that we see is a sort of rabbit or hare damage. And you can see here the hare damage on a new crop. And once the hares start munching on it, they'll go back to the same spot and continue to damage that crop. Once the crop gets going a little bit, again, they won't touch it. It's not nice for them to be eating, but what they'll do is keep on chewing on those small plants. What can we do about this? Well, this comes back to your sort of planning and prep. It's really important that if you know you've got a really heavy rabbit burden, to make sure that you've got appropriate fencing or that you manage your population prior to planting. You'll also see there that I've included sheep damage along with this. I was speaking to a farmer recently who had said that he was grazing his field boundaries with sheep. You do get that at the wrong time and they'll cause just as much damage. So it's if you're going to do that or have stock around your fields, then it's really important that everything's fenced right. So sometimes you will get establishment issues, and if you're in this unfortunate position, we need to do something about this. Leaving these gaps, the Miscanthus won't spread in there, and all you're going to do is have a nice hole that will fill up with weeds. So really, your only option in this situation is to go in by hand and sort of dig holes and plant rhizomes. Obviously, this is really labour intensive, so hence why it's so important to get things right from the beginning. The other time we might see gaps forming in crops is if we've got a really old crop, and sometimes the older rhizome can start to die and the crop will thin out. You won't lose the crop, it will just become a little bit thinner. In this case, we can use some mechanical help to sort of sort this, and what we would do is probably go through the crop with a set of discs, break it up, and then do some surface cultivation with something like a rotavator to spread those rhizomes out, and then roll it. Of course, this will give you an impact on your yield for a few years, but it will certainly thicken up the plot and sort of long term could have a positive impact. But then obviously, so we've established our crop really well. We've really nailed the first year agronomy, and then we're coming into our harvest. And obviously, harvesting in February or March, we do have to think about weather concerns, just as you do with the willow. And really, we've got two options. Ideally, we're going to just get on and harvest our crop. But if it's too wet, we certainly don't want to be in a situation where we're pulling harvesters out of crops. That's going to cause lots of damage. So what can we do? Well, we've got two options. One is we simply just leave the crop. Leave the standing crop and just harvest it next year. There is a yield penalty to this. You'll lose a bit of your standing crop and your new growth won't be quite as vigorous, but you'll certainly be able to, the following year, take a substantial harvest from that crop. Your second option would be to postpone your harvest, wait until it's a bit later, hope the field dries out. But this has risks involved with it as well. So in these photos, you can see the yellow lines. There should be rows of plants in those yellow lines, but where it was baled really late, the whole of that row has been ripped up by the baler. These plants will come back from the rhizomes underneath, but that's obviously going to impact your yield. The other thing to be thinking about when we're harvesting these crops is after it's baled, what do we do with our bales? In the right-hand picture, the damage that you see there has been caused by the contractor stacking bales on the side of the field. So just stacking the bales up, loading the trailers, all that movement, you can see there's a huge amount of damage. That's just something to be thinking about when we're completing our harvest. And obviously traveling on the field when it's wet may risk sort of creating some compaction on your soil. And what impact does that have on your yield? Well, compaction will limit your yield a bit, but in trials that have been run in Ireland, the impact of compaction through traveling on wet fields is much lower on yield than it would be for a late harvest. So harvesting later had a much bigger impact on the subsequent yields. And if we are worried about the compaction, certainly on the areas that are being travelled on regularly, then quite simply we can just put a subsoiler through the crop. This will help lift the crop, break the rhizome up a little bit, and then your yield will improve. It's not going to be sort of an overnight improvement, but it will steadily improve over the next couple of years. So this isn't something that needs to be done super regularly, but sort of something to be thinking about once your crop gets a bit older. So yeah, that was my last slide. Hopefully those have been useful for you. And yeah, are there any questions?
Right, thanks, Chris. That was really interesting introduction to the crop. Lots of really useful, practical information for people thinking about growing these crops. I've got a couple of questions for you, and then I'd like to bring Will back in for a bit more of a panel discussion, if that's okay. I can see there are a couple of questions in the chat and the Q&A about the willow, so I'll put those to Will in a few moments. But if you do have more questions for Chris, please add those into the chat or the Q&A. I think there are some problems with the system online today. So I guess the first question is, can you ever get a useful crop yield from that year one growth? So obviously year one, the crop grows, but not to the height that it'll achieve in later years. So should you just cut it and leave it as mulch, or is it worth actually collecting?
Yeah, so generally it won't be worth collecting. Generally the the sort of the cost of cutting and baling and everything else would be far higher than the yield that you're going to get from the crop. So yeah, at that point, it was first year generally it would just be to top the crop and use that as a little bit of additional mulch.
Okay, that's fine. And just one about the kind of future of Miscanthus. So one of the differences between Miscanthus and Willow is this kind of mixture, that Willow is planted as a 6-way mix and Miscanthus is planted as a monoculture of a single variety. Is there a danger with that of future problems? And are there any ways of future-proofing it? Or is there a move to plant mixed varieties? Is that possible for this crop?
So there obviously are possible risks with growing monocultures in large areas. Obviously, if then currently there aren't any diseases or significant pests, but if they did come along, that could have a big impact. Sort of in the pipeline at the moment, there's lots of effort going on for breeding new varieties. So not far down the line, there's lots of new varieties that will be coming onto the market that will help provide that sort of support to fight against the pests and diseases. Yeah.
And would you imagine those being planted as single variety plantations, but just being able to select more for the particular set of conditions that a field is in?
Yeah, I would think most likely they'd stay as single variety populations. A lot of the newer populations sort of have different characteristics, different morphologies, and so they then require sort of different planting densities and things like that. So yeah, they probably stay as single varieties.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Chris. Will, do you want to join us? Put your camera and mic back on. There you are. Okay. So there's a couple of questions in the chat for you, Will, on the Willow. So the first one's from Neil Watkins from Eco Crops, and I can see he's asking about varieties, and you've put a link to the variety guide that you mentioned. But his question is when farmers are using organic systems or intercropping, are there particular varieties that you'd recommend? And I guess it's maybe what are the main problems that those farmers might come across that you could work around by good variety selection?
Yeah, I think there's maybe a bit of a knowledge gap of how varieties interact with those different systems. We've tried some inter-row cropping, a legume-rich crop in the inter-row space, and we did actually have some issues with that, providing competition to the willow, so effectively acting like a weed. I think they have got some really good potential, nitrogen fixing and pollinator services, but I think if they actually shade out the willow, it needs to be done quite carefully. And I'm sure that Neil's an expert in this and has got a good system, but I think for people that are doing it, just hearing about it is a good idea and maybe looking to try it themselves. It's quite a difficult dynamic to hit the balance. So you've got the crop that's trying to get canopy closure to shade out weeds. And then if you're trying to establish something in the understory, you need to really think about what you're going to establish and how it might work. With the willow varieties, we kind of have got the slightly different ones. There's varieties like Endurance, which has got a big, broad leaf and really shades out weeds really well. And then there are other more lanceolate shaped leaves, like varieties like Viminala scherinii hybrids, which maybe let a bit more light penetrate into the canopy. So they maybe give you different options to play with.
And would it be a real focus on that kind of outcompeting the weeds rather than pest and disease resistance in an organic system? Would it be the weeds that you'd be most worried about?
Yeah, I think it depends. If it's a kind of organic arable system, maybe the weed seed burden isn't so good, but maybe in a grassland system, it might need to be a bit more vigilant, and cultural methods like mowing or intervo cultivation, kind of rotation, might be needed to control the weeds. So it's horses for courses really, and I think the land managers will know about the history of their site and it might be able to predict what the challenges might be.
Okay, thanks very much, Will. So another question on Willow, so you're still on the hot seat. A question from Cassia, which is, how should the six-way willow mix be distributed, and can different varieties be in blocks or strips or just completely mixed up? So yeah, practically, how is it done?
Yeah, so there was a lot of research done by colleagues in Northern Ireland, actually, with the main aim of looking at rust resistance, and they really studied mixtures, and they did everything from a really intimate mixture where a 20 centimetre cutting was all mixed randomly through to quite big blocks, and the general outcome from that was the more intimate, the better. Now, with commercial plantations, they're normally planted with a step planter at the moment, and your kind of units are a 2 metre long rod, which the step planter cuts up into the 20 centimetre cuttings. So I think really the answer to the question would be to mix them, get your 6 varieties and mix those 2 metre rods as intimately as possible. And then kind of, it doesn't need to be very formal, but just mix them as much as possible, so you get lots of little runs of about 10 plants of the different varieties, and that will give you the most kind of easily achievable but kind of practical, pragmatic mixture, and that will give a good mix across the field. So I think that's what I go for.
Okay, thanks, Will. I mean, a question for both of you. You both talked a lot about the importance of getting establishment right, getting weed control right, because giving these crops that good start really allows them to kind of get their roots down and get going. So is it worth doing an establishment survey, say 12 months in, really looking at the success and the gaps? And is it kind of worth doing that gapping up if you did a kind of cost benefit? Is it worth putting that effort in? Because you both mentioned it's quite labour intensive to do the gapping up. So Chris, I don't know if you want to go at this first, but yeah, establishment and gapping up, what's worth doing?
Yeah, so I think it would always be really valuable to have those establishment assessments and to see how well you've got that establishment. There is always going to be a bit of a spot where if you've got sort of relatively good establishment, then you may wish to not follow on with your gapping up, because the cost and work is going to cost more than the kind of the impact on your yield. But I think doing anything is always really going to benefit these crops, because when we're looking at 15, 20 years plus of crops, although the setup of these crops seems quite expensive, and especially if you're adding extra bits like the gapping up, that's going to impact your yield for 20 years plus. So it's always going to have a positive impact for sure.
Well, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit earlier. I think with Willow, there's 2 main options. It's actually doing it immediately after planting, and I think having the discussion with your contractor about what they hope they'd achieve, and kind of just monitoring them and policing it a little bit to check that there aren't obvious gaps on the day. So maybe walk a couple of rows behind the planter. If it's looking good, then I'm sure it'll be fine. With Willow, people plant around, they aim for 16,666 plants per hectare, but with the plan that actually you can deal with a little bit of loss and going for about 15,000. So you can lose a little bit. So if it looks all right on the day of planting, it is worth keeping an eye on it. And then the window to do it is in the winter, and you can use material that's grown in that field for gapping up. So plant breeders' rights mean that you can't kind of establish a new area with the varieties that you've planted, but you can gap up the area that you've planted, and using that material to gap up any spaces. And I'd look to identify if you just got the odd little miss here and there, the plants will probably compensate and grow into that space and won't reduce yield too much. But it's if you've got kind of patches and big gaps, then it really is worth doing. And actually, you could put a lot of energy into gapping up kind of a miss here and there, and the established plants around it will actually outcompete it, so it won't establish that well. But if you have got a gap, try and diagnose what's gone wrong there. Is it because of weed competition? And then don't just gap up because you've got a gap and there's weeds there. You might think, well, I need to address this, and it might need a little bit of spot treating and some spraying, and then gap up into that, having kind of tried to solve the situation. But it really is worth doing. And like Chris said, it's your one chance to kind of have a plan B and try and correct it. And that yield going forward is that's how you make your money, and that attention to detail is really important.
Great, thanks very much, Will. I'm going to wrap the questions up there because we're just a few minutes off the close of the webinar today. So Will and Chris, I'm sure everyone has learned a lot from this webinar. I certainly have. It's been like having two agony uncles, all the questions that I wanted answering all at once. So thank you both so much. If you enjoyed this webinar, then you'll be glad to know that we'll be back in January 2025 for a whistle-stop tour of some important decision-making tools, EnviroCrops and the Farm Carbon Toolkit. So all of our webinars are recorded and on our YouTube channel. So if you want to listen again to this, please go there. And there's also all of the other webinars that we've been delivering through the Biomass Connect project. If you're watching after the event, please subscribe. And if you enjoy what you see, then give us a like, because all of this helps our profile. So as we found out today, decision making with biomass crops is a complex process. There's a lot to think about. And the same can be said of carbon farming. And in both cases, farmers are likely to be making decisions that could impact their business for the next 20 years. So it's really important you start off with all the information so you can make the best decision for your land, your facilities, your lifestyle, and the markets that you're hoping to attract. So if you make just one New Year's resolution, make sure that it's to sign up to what promises to be another fascinating webinar with Biomass Connect. And if you want to have a bit of biomass crops related fun over the holiday period and to test your knowledge from today's webinar, then I highly recommend the Cropper game, which you can see on your screen now, flicking through, that's been developed by the EnviroCrops team. So in just 20 minutes, you can go from a biomass crops novice to an expert, find out all the do's and don'ts, and work out all of the things not to do without the pain of it happening in real life. So you can understand how actions can have consequences for the crop. And that game is available on the EnviroCrops website. So finally, I just want to tell you about the Biomass Connect partners, and a big thank you to our sponsor, Desnes. We have lots of social media, so if you can't get enough of Biomass Connect, then go to all of the usual social media places. And finally, have a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and we hope to see you again in January. Take care and have a great holiday. Thanks. Goodbye.